After 4.5 years of legal fighting, the trucking industry has lost, and the fallout is now hitting the backbone of American commerce. At this moment, 70,000 independent truckers are being pushed out of California. Not next year, not months from now. It is happening right now. If supply chains matter to you, if rising prices matter to you, if the future of American logistics matters to you, subscribe now and stay with this video. What comes next affects everyone watching. The largest freight carriers in the country are no longer issuing warnings. They are giving instructions. Companies like Landstar are telling drivers to shut it down and leave California altogether. This is not a short-term disruption. This is a mass exit. And it raises a question that is both simple and unsettling. What kind of law is powerful enough to clear highways and disrupt the busiest ports in the nation? The answer begins with a courtroom loss that sent shockwaves through dispatch offices across the state. From San Diego to Sacramento, dispatch centers came alive the moment the decision came down. Within 72 hours, carrier offices statewide were scrambling. Crisis planning replaced routine operations almost overnight. Landstar, one of the most established names in freight logistics, issued urgent notices across its entire network. The message left no room for interpretation. California was now a liability. The new legal environment brought audits, fines, and the serious risk of retroactive penalties going back years. Drivers who had spent decades building relationships with California shippers were suddenly forced into an impossible choice: stay and risk financial collapse, or walk away from everything they had built. Inside trucking offices, conversations shifted instantly. The focus was no longer on finding loads or negotiating rates. It became about survival. Other carriers watched the situation closely and ran their own numbers. Some quietly removed California freight from their load boards. Others warned drivers to avoid any shipment tied to the state. Owner-operators, many of whom had invested their life savings into their trucks, watched as their phones stopped ringing. One driver summed it up perfectly. One week, I was hauling produce out of the Central Valley. The next week, there was nothing. The industry did not wait for enforcement notices to land in the mail. Risk managers and corporate lawyers ran the numbers early and reached the same hard conclusion. Losing California business now was safer than facing six-figure penalties later. This was not fear-driven panic. It was a calculated withdrawal. Companies reviewed their exposure and made unemotional decisions. Compliance costs were too high. The consequences of getting it wrong were devastating. Faced with that reality, they chose the only option left to them. They walked away. For independent truckers, the calculation was even harsher. These were not employees with benefits or corporate protection. These were small business owners who had put everything on the line to keep their trucks moving. Their savings, their credit, their futures were tied to their rigs. And then, without warning, the rules beneath them changed. The legal fight was over, but it did not end with a dramatic ruling or a final gavel strike. It ended quietly. It ended with dispatchers removing loads, with drivers rerouting plans, with people realizing there was no longer a viable future on California highways. The law had made its decision. The market responded immediately and without mercy. California had just lost 70,000 truckers, and the consequences were only beginning to spread. To understand how this happened, you have to look at Assembly Bill 5. Signed into law in September of 2019, AB 5 introduced what is known as the ABC test. At first glance, it appears straightforward. The test determines whether a worker is classified as an independent contractor or an employee. To remain independent, all three parts must be met. Prong A requires freedom from company control. Most owner-operators pass this easily. They choose their routes, maintain their equipment, and operate their businesses on their own terms. Prong C requires operating an established trade or business. Once again, truckers clearly qualify. They put hundreds of thousands of dollars into trucks, permits, insurance, and day-to-day operations. But then there is Prong B, and this is where the entire system breaks down. Prong B requires that the work being performed fall outside the normal business of the company doing the hiring. For truckers leased to motor carriers, that standard cannot be met. Moving freight is the core function of every trucking company. There is no workaround. The moment an owner-operator hauls a load for a carrier, the law treats that driver as an employee. Under California Labor Code Section 2775, that classification happens automatically. There is no discussion, no flexibility, no allowance for how the trucking industry actually operates. The law leaves no room for reality. Other professions saw this problem early and secured exemptions written directly into the statute. Doctors were carved out, insurance brokers were protected, real estate agents and engineers were included as well. Truckers were not. For 70,000 owner-operators, Prong B is not a guideline. It is a dead end. The independence they spent years building, the businesses they sacrificed for, the reputations they earned, all of it is wiped away by a single line in state law. These are not workers asking to be classified as employees. These are business owners who accepted the risk and reward of running their own operations. And now they are being told that choice no longer exists in California. The law leaves them with two choices: become employees and give up the independence that defines their work, or leave the state altogether. For most, that decision has already been made. They are leaving. Every number in this story represents a real person. 70,000 owner-operators means 70,000 individuals who took a chance on themselves. Many operate trucks worth $150,000 or more, paid for through years of savings, family help, and personal sacrifice. These are not gig workers taking occasional jobs. These are small business owners who carry every expense on their own: insurance, fuel, maintenance, major engine repairs. They built their lives around the ability to keep freight moving and their businesses solvent. Assembly Bill 5 does not put a single job at risk. It wipes out entire businesses in an instant. For the carriers that rely on these drivers, the financial reality is just as unforgiving. Turning an independent contractor into an employee is not a simple paperwork change. It means taking on payroll taxes, health coverage, workers' compensation, and paid leave, while also absorbing fuel and maintenance costs that drivers previously handled themselves. For one truck, those added expenses can climb into the tens of thousands of dollars each year. Scale that across dozens or hundreds of trucks, and the numbers fall apart fast. Most small and mid-sized carriers cannot afford that shift, and most owner-operators will not accept it. They did not build companies just to return to employee status. They built businesses to control their schedules, their location, and their income. When that control disappears, there is no future left for them in California. This law does not merely adjust how trucking operates. It removes the foundation that 70,000 small businesses were built on. It does it all at once, without a transition period, without compromise, and without regard for the lives caught in the middle. The outcome is not adaptation. This is not adjustment. It is abandonment. Truckers are not staying to challenge this. They are leaving, and they are taking their trucks, their experience, and their economic value with them. California is not losing workers. It is losing entrepreneurs. That distinction matters far more than the state appears to recognize, because once those trucks leave, they do not return. And the impact of that exit is about to spread across every layer of California's economy. January 1st brought another shock. Across the state, 473 gas stations shut down permanently. At the center of those closures is Senate Bill 445, a mandate requiring fuel stations to replace underground storage tanks. The cost per location can reach $2 million. For most small station owners, that number is impossible to absorb. The state promised financial assistance through a program meant to help struggling operators. But that program stalled under delays, paperwork, and administrative bottlenecks. Owners waited for years for support that never arrived. At the same time, deadlines stayed fixed and penalties continued to stack up. Every day past compliance brought fines ranging from $15,000 to $20,000. The math offered no way out. Faced with overwhelming upgrade costs and non-stop penalties, hundreds of family-owned stations closed for good. rural areas were hit the hardest. Stations that served as the only fuel stop for 20 or 30 miles disappeared almost overnight. Pumps locked, signs faded, lots emptied where drivers once fueled up before long runs inland. For the trucks still operating in California, a new danger emerged. Not a lack of freight, but the real possibility of running out of fuel far from help. Highways that once had stations every 10 miles now stretch 50 miles or more between open pumps. Drivers who used to plan around delivery times now plan around where they can refuel. The fuel desert is no longer theoretical. It is the new reality. You can see it in the quiet of closed stations and the widening gaps between operating fuel stops. Emergency services are feeling it as well. Fire engines and ambulances in rural counties now travel 30 miles just to refuel. That distance translates into lost minutes during fires, medical calls, and serious accidents. Corporate logistics teams are now reworking entire supply chains around fuel uncertainty. Some are already advising clients to avoid California routes entirely. The combination of fewer trucks and fewer fuel stations is creating a problem that feeds on itself. Even if a driver wanted to continue operating in California, the support system needed to do that job is steadily disappearing. Then the refineries began to shut down. Phillips 66, a company tied to California fuel production for more than a century, closed its Los Angeles refinery in October of 2025. That single decision removed 139,000 barrels per day of refining capacity. Nearly 8% of the state's fuel output vanished at once. 6 months later, Valero announced that its Benicia refinery would wind down operations by April 2026. That move takes another 145,000 barrels per day offline. Together, these two closures eliminate more than 17% of California's refining capacity in less than a year. Refineries are more than industrial facilities. They are the backbone of diesel and gasoline supply. When a plant of this size shuts down, the effects ripple far beyond its gates. Fuel distributors scramble to secure new sources. Trucking companies see costs rise while margins tighten. Workers who spent decades inside those facilities face sudden unemployment. Local governments lose millions in tax revenue tied to those operations. The loss of nearly 300,000 barrels per day means less diesel for the trucks that move California's economy. As refining capacity shrinks, flexibility disappears. A system that once had room to absorb shocks now runs on razor-thin margins. A single disruption, whether it is a pipeline issue, a delayed tanker, or a surge in demand, can send prices climbing or leave trucks waiting for fuel that simply is not there. California assumed it could force rapid change across its energy and labor sectors without serious consequences. That assumption is now being tested in real time, and the early signals are troubling. Fuel prices are rising, supply is tightening, and the infrastructure needed to support heavy industry is eroding faster than expected. The margin for error is shrinking, and in a state that handles 40% of the nation's imports through its ports, there is no margin to lose. The issue is no longer whether disruptions will happen. The real question is how severe they will be and how quickly the impact will spread beyond California. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach sit at the center of American trade. Together, they handle nearly 40% of all shipping containers entering the United States. With a combined capacity of more than 10 million 20-foot equivalent units each year, these ports rely completely on a constant flow of trucks. Cargo moves from dockside cranes to warehouses, distribution centers, and rail yards. That flow is now starting to break. As owner-operators weigh the legal risks of staying in California and fuel stations shut down by the hundreds, fewer trucks are arriving to move freight. Port supervisors and freight forwarders are watching the change happen in real time. Containers are stacking higher in terminal yards. Dwell times are stretching longer. Shipping companies are taking notice. Some carriers are quietly shifting contracts to ports in Texas and along the East Coast. The decision is simple: pay higher rates for a shrinking pool of California trucks, or move operations to states where the logistics system is more stable. Shipping executives are not reacting emotionally. They are responding to financial reality. The effects are already spreading outward. Warehouses that depend on steady container deliveries are dealing with delays. Retailers are seeing gaps on shelves. Manufacturers are paying more to move both raw materials and finished goods. What begins as a California issue quickly turns into a national one because these ports are not regional facilities. They are the primary entry point for goods arriving from Asia. Electronics, clothing, auto parts, household products, all of it moves through Los Angeles and Long Beach. When these ports slow down, the impact reaches every corner of the country. Supply chain planners are now warning clients about unpredictable delivery timelines. Some are advising companies to carry larger inventories. Others are pushing for entirely different shipping routes. California's position as a logistics powerhouse no longer feels guaranteed. The infrastructure that once made the state essential is weakening, and competitors are paying attention. Ports in Houston, Savannah, and Newark are moving quickly, investing heavily in new capacity to capture business that California is beginning to lose. They see an opening, and they are moving quickly to claim market share that California is losing by default. This is what a perfect storm actually looks like. Not one dramatic collapse, but a chain of policy decisions colliding at the same time. Assembly Bill 5 pushes 70,000 truckers out of the state. Senate Bill 445 shuts down hundreds of fuel stations. Refinery closures remove 17% of California's fuel supply, and the ports, once considered untouchable, begin to strain under the combined pressure. This convergence was never planned. Each policy was pursued on its own, backed by different arguments and different political groups. But outcomes do not respond to intent, they respond to reality. And the reality is that California is choking the supply chain responsible for moving 40% of America's imports. The delays are no longer hypothetical, they can be measured. Containers are sitting longer at terminals, trucks are harder to secure, fuel costs more and is harder to find. Companies are no longer waiting to see how this plays out. They are making long-term decisions to shift their operations elsewhere. This is not a disruption that fixes itself with time. It is a structural change. And once that change locks in, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. The real cost of these policies is only starting to come into focus. 70,000 truckers pushed out, 473 fuel stations closed, 2 major refineries shut down, and ports that once powered the national economy now face an uncertain future. California built its logistics network over decades. It became a global benchmark. But infrastructure is fragile. It depends on people, fuel, and capital. When policies drive those elements away, the system does not adjust. It fails. The question now is whether California will acknowledge the scale of this crisis before the damage becomes permanent, or whether it will continue down a path that places ideology ahead of economic reality. For the truckers who have already left, the answer no longer matters. They are gone, and they are not coming back. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts on what California should do next. Share this video with anyone who cares about the future of American logistics, because this story is far from over. The choices made in the coming months will decide whether California remains a logistics leader or becomes a warning of what happens when policy races ahead of reality.